By 1849, 10,000 men had vanished into the Sierra Nevada chasing gold, and nearly half of them were dying of something that had nothing to do with mining. Number 19 on this list stopped a disease that killed more 49ers than accidents and violence combined. Number 6 grew beside the very mercury that was poisoning them. These are 25 remedies that kept gold rush miners alive when the nearest doctor was a mountain away. Lime juice did not save the British Navy by accident. It saved them because someone finally listened to 200 years of sailors saying citrus stopped the bleeding gums and the loosening teeth. By the time gold fever hit California in 1849, that knowledge had crossed an ocean and a continent. Merchants in San Francisco sold barrels of lime juice at prices that would have been outrageous anywhere else, and miners paid them without hesitation. The reason becomes obvious the moment you understand what scurvy actually does to a body. Vitamin C. Deficiency does not announce itself quickly. It builds for weeks while a man eats nothing but salt pork, hardtack, and beans, and then one morning his gums bleed when he brushes them with a rag. A camp that had no lime juice within reach watched that progression turn fatal within a season. The merchants who sold it knew exactly what they had, and what grew wild in the canyons, completely free, was about to make some of them obsolete. Miner's lettuce earned its name for a reason that had nothing to do with taste. The small, succulent plant carpeted shaded slopes across the gold country, and it delivered more vitamin C per ounce than the lime juice merchants were charging a day's wage for. Miners who learned to recognize the round, cup-shaped leaves ate it raw, straight from the ground, and stopped paying for what was already growing at their feet. The merchants selling lime juice never advertised this. There was no profit in telling a customer the cure was free. Mercury was everywhere in the gold fields, and almost nobody understood what it was doing to them. Miners used it constantly to separate gold from crushed ore, working the silvery liquid barehanded for hours at a time. The tremors came first, then the memory loss, the loosened teeth, the personality changes that camp doctors had no name for. What stopped the worst of it was not medicine. It was something growing in the very soil the mercury had contaminated. Yarrow pulled double duty in mining camps in a way almost no other plant could match. Crushed and pressed into a wound, it slowed bleeding within minutes through a compound called achillin that triggers the body's clotting response directly. But miners also used it as a wash for skin exposed to mercury, and modern research has confirmed mild chelating properties in several Yarrow compounds that may have offered some protection nobody at the time could explain. They just knew the men who used it seemed to fare better. That observation traveled from camp to camp faster than any physician could. Altitude did something to newcomers that veteran miners had stopped noticing in themselves. A man who climbed too fast into the high Sierra got headaches that would not quit, nausea that emptied his stomach, and a breathlessness that would not resolve with rest. Camp veterans had a name for it, and a remedy nobody back east had ever heard of. Manzanita berries were the high-altitude fix that arrived through direct contact with Miwok and Maidu communities, who had managed elevation sickness for generations before any miner showed up. The tart red berries, chewed raw or steeped into a tea, contained compounds with confirmed diuretic and mild stimulant properties that help the body adjust fluid balance during acclimatization. Miners who learned the plant from indigenous neighbors passed it down the supply chain to newcomers struggling on their first week at 9,000 feet. The newcomers who ignored it sometimes did not get a second week to learn the lesson. A broken leg in a mining camp was a death sentence dressed up as an injury. There was no cast, no splint kit, no doctor within a day's travel in most camps. What miners had instead was something growing along every creek they panned. Comfrey earned the name Knitbone for a reason that sounds almost too direct to be real. The crushed leaves, mixed with whatever fat was available and packed thick around a break, contained allantoin, a compound that stimulates cell regeneration in damaged tissue. Miners wrapped the poultice tight with strips of canvas tent and changed it daily, sometimes for 6 weeks straight, immobilizing the limb as best they could with whatever wood was on hand. Modern clinical trials have confirmed Comfrey extract outperforms standard pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories for soft tissue injury. What miners did not know was the chemistry. What they knew was that the men who used it walked again. Dysentery moved through mining camps the way fire moves through dry timber, fast, indiscriminate, and capable of emptying a camp of half its population within a single bad month. Contaminated creek water did the damage. What stopped it had been sitting in the woodlot the entire time. Oak bark, boiled into a dark, astringent tea, delivered tannins concentrated enough to bind directly to inflamed intestinal tissue and reduce the fluid loss that made severe dysentery fatal. Camp cooks who understood this kept a pot of oak bark tea going during outbreaks the way modern hospitals keep saline drips running. It did not cure the underlying infection. What it did was buy a man enough time and enough hydration to survive long enough for his own immune system to finish the job. In a camp with no doctor, buying time was the entire treatment. Snowbound camps faced a winter problem that summer mining never prepared anyone for. Frostbite crept in through wet boots and exposed hands, and by the time a man noticed the numbness, real tissue damage had often already begun. Wintergreen oil, distilled from the low evergreen plant that carpeted high-elevation forest floors, contains methyl salicylate, a compound with confirmed circulation, stimulating and anti-inflammatory properties almost identical to aspirin's active chemistry. Rubbed into frostbitten extremities as they slowly warmed, it eased the searing pain that accompanies returning circulation and reduced the inflammatory damage that follows tissue freezing. Miners learned quickly that warming frostbite too fast caused more damage than the cold itself. Wintergreen, applied during the slow rewarming process, became the difference between a man who kept all his fingers and one who did not. Soap had to be made from scratch in most camps, and the plant that made it possible was hiding in plain sight along every dry hillside. Soap root, also called Indian soap plant, produces a bulb that lathers into genuine cleansing foam when crushed and worked with water. Miners who had no access to manufactured soap used it for wound cleaning at a time when nobody understood germ theory, but everyone understood that clean wounds healed, and dirty ones did not. The saponins, responsible for the lathering action, have confirmed mild antimicrobial properties beyond simple mechanical cleansing. A plant that most Easterners would have walked past without a second glance became the closest thing some camps had to surgical hygiene. Camp fever was the term miners used for almost any unexplained illness that swept through close quarters, and one specific version of it terrified everyone for a reason nobody fully understood until decades later. Typhoid fever, transmitted through contaminated water, exactly like dysentery but far more lethal, killed entire camps in waves that survivors described as something close to plague. Quinine bark, imported at enormous expense from South America, was the closest thing to a specific treatment available, though its real strength was against malaria rather than typhoid. Camps that stocked it anyway used it broadly for any unexplained fever, on the theory that something was better than nothing. Sometimes it helped through mechanisms nobody at the time could name. Sometimes it did nothing at all. The uncertainty itself tells you how desperate medicine in the gold fields really was. A toothache in a mining camp was not a minor inconvenience. It was an emergency, with no dentist for 100 miles in any direction. Clove oil, traded into camps through Chinese merchants who had arrived in significant numbers by the early 1850s, delivered eugenol, a compound that blocks the sodium channels responsible for transmitting pain signals from an inflamed tooth nerve. A single drop on cotton pressed against the aching tooth, produced numbness within minutes through the exact same mechanism dentists use today in temporary filling compounds. The trade routes that brought clove oil into the Sierra foothills connected gold country to a supply chain stretching across the Pacific, proof that even the most isolated camps were never entirely cut off from the wider world. Snake encounters were a near-daily reality in the lower elevations, where rattlesnakes shared the same rocky terrain miners were digging through, and the response had to be immediate. Plantain leaf, the same low-growing weed that grew along every trail and trampled path, was chewed quickly and pressed directly onto a snake bite while someone ran for help that might be hours away. The allantoin in the leaf supported tissue healing at the bite margin, though no plant on this list could neutralize venom outright. What plantain bought, again, was time, reduced local inflammation, and a barrier against secondary infection, while the body's own systems worked to manage the venom load. Miners who survived serious bites often credited the plant. Whether it deserved full credit or simply helped at the margins, nobody walked past it without using it. Burns happened constantly around camp cook fires, and the crude furnaces some operations used for processing ore, and the treatment available was simpler than almost anything else on this list. Aloe vera was not native to the Sierra Nevada, but Mexican and Spanish Californian miners brought cultivated plants with them from regions where it had been medicine for generations. The clear gel, pressed directly onto a burn, created a cooling barrier and accelerated healing, measurably faster than leaving a burn exposed to open air. Clinical research conducted more than a century later confirmed aloe-treated burns heal an average of 9 days faster than standard dressings. The miners who carried potted aloe plants into the gold fields had no clinical trial to point to. They had results. They could see within days. Exhaustion in the gold fields was not the ordinary tiredness of hard work. It was something deeper, the kind that came from months of inadequate food, brutal labor, and bodies pushed past what they could sustainably give. Ginseng, though not native to California, arrived through Chinese merchants and herbalists who set up shop in mining towns by the thousands during the 1850s. Miners who could afford it used it as a general restorative. Modern research into ginsenosides, the plant's active compounds, has confirmed measurable reductions in fatigue and improvements in physical performance under sustained physical stress. The herb shops that Chinese immigrants established in towns like Weaverville and Mariposa became medical infrastructure for camps that had no other access to organized care. A piece of gold rush history that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Eye infections spread easily in camps where clean water for washing was scarce, and dust from digging coated everything, including the eyes themselves. Eyebright, a small wildflower that grew in mountain meadows, was steeped into a weak tea and used as a wash for inflamed and infected eyes. The plant contains tannins and flavonoids, with confirmed mild astringent and anti-inflammatory properties that reduce the swelling and discharge associated with conjunctivitis. It was not a cure for serious eye disease, and miners who developed genuine infections often lost vision permanently regardless of treatment. But for the everyday irritation that dust and grit produced constantly, Eyebright Wash was the difference between working through the day and being functionally blind by noon. Joint pain became universal among miners within a single season of constant kneeling, lifting, and working in cold creek water for hours at a stretch. Willow bark boiled into a bitter tea delivered salicin, the same compound that would later be synthesized into aspirin nearly 50 years after the gold rush ended. Miners chewed strips of the bark directly or brewed it for the ache that settled into knees and backs after months of panning in icy water. The plant grew along every creek they were already working, meaning the medicine and the misery shared the same location. A coincidence that meant nobody had to travel far for relief. Respiratory illness took hold fast in camps, where men slept in damp canvas tents through mountain winters with temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Mullein leaf, dried and steeped into tea, soothed the irritated airways and loosened the thick congestion that settled into miners' chests through long winters. Verbascicide in mullein has confirmed anti-inflammatory activity in respiratory tissue, explaining why a plant with no formal medical credentials kept working season after season. Camp cooks often kept dried mullein hanging from tent poles, specifically for the men who started coughing as the first cold nights arrived, treating it as preventive stock the way a modern household keeps cold medicine on hand before flu season. Here is the part of this story that almost never gets told. The gold rush did not just bring miners into contact with gold. It forced together Chinese herbalists, Mexican curanderos, Miwok and Maidu healers, and frontier doctors from the eastern United States into the same isolated camps, all of them trading medical knowledge out of pure necessity. A remedy that started in one tradition spread to the others within a season, because survival did not care where the knowledge came from. That fusion produced a medical culture more diverse and more practical than almost anywhere else in 19th century America, built entirely by people who had no other choice. Insomnia plagued men whose bodies were exhausted but whose minds would not quiet down after months of anxiety over claims, debts, and the constant threat of violence. Wild lettuce, harvested and dried into a mild sedative preparation, contains lactucarium, a compound with confirmed mild analgesic and sedative properties that 19th century physicians sometimes called lettuce opium for its calming effect, though it carries none of opium's dependency risk. Miners who could not sleep brewed it into a bitter tea before bed. It would not knock a man unconscious. What it did was take the edge off a mind that had been running too hot for too long, which in a camp full of armed, exhausted, desperate men mattered more than most remedies on this list. Hunger itself became a medical condition in camps where supply trains failed to arrive on schedule and men went weeks on dwindling rations. Camas bulbs, harvested from meadows where indigenous peoples had cultivated and managed the plant for centuries, provided genuine caloric density when food supplies ran short. Roasted slowly, the bulbs converted their starches into digestible sugars and offered miners a survival food they would never have recognized without guidance from native communities who had built entire seasonal economies around camas harvests. The irony sits heavy here. The same gold rush that displaced and devastated indigenous communities across California also depended quietly and repeatedly on indigenous knowledge to keep its participants alive. The final remedy on this list was not a plant at all, and it explains more about the gold fields than any single herb could. Epsom salt, shipped in at real expense from established suppliers, was dissolved into hot water for soaking aching muscles, treating constipation, and drawing out infection from minor wounds. Magnesium sulfate, its active compound, has confirmed anti-inflammatory and muscle-relaxing properties that miners experienced directly every time they soaked exhausted legs after a 16-hour day. What makes this remedy different from every plant on this list is that it had to be purchased, transported, and rationed. A reminder that even in a landscape full of free medicine growing wild, some relief still came down to money, supply lines, and who could afford to wait for the next shipment. German and Eastern European immigrants who poured into the goldfields by the early 1850s brought a food preservation method that turned out to double as medicine. Sauerkraut, fermented in barrels that traveled with these communities into the Sierra foothills, retained significant vitamin C even after months of storage, because the fermentation process itself helps preserve the nutrient. Miners who had access to it through German-run boarding houses got a scurvy defense that required no foraging at all, just a jar that kept for an entire winter without spoiling. The lactic acid bacteria responsible for the fermentation also produced compounds with confirmed antimicrobial activity, meaning the same barrel doing double duty as food was quietly treating the gut as well. A wound left untreated in the gold fields rarely stayed simple. Within days, it could turn into something that threatened the whole limb. Wild onion bulbs, dug from meadows across the gold country, were crushed and applied directly to wounds, showing the first signs of infection. The allicin released when the bulb was crushed delivered measurable antimicrobial activity against the bacteria most responsible for wound sepsis. The same chemistry was later confirmed in laboratory studies, a full century after miners were already relying on it. Camps with no other option crushed onion bulbs the way a modern household reaches for antibiotic ointment, without ever knowing the mechanism behind why it worked. Sagebrush covered entire hillsides across the high desert approaches to the gold country, and miners passing through quickly learned it was not just scenery. The leaves, crushed and inhaled or steeped into a strong tea, cleared congested sinuses and chest tightness that built up from constant dust exposure in the diggings. The Thujanean and camphor compounds in sagebrush have confirmed decongestant and mild antimicrobial properties, explaining why a plant most travelers dismissed as worthless scrub became standard respiratory relief for men breathing in pulverized rock all day. The smell alone, sharp and immediate, was often enough to signal a man was using it correctly. Burns from camp stoves were one thing. Burns from the open sluice fires used in certain ore processing operations were something else entirely, and the response needed to work fast. Fireweed, the tall pink-flowered plant that colonized burned and disturbed ground across the Sierra after wildfires swept through, produced a leaf preparation miners applied directly to burns and irritated skin. The plant contains tannins and flavonoids with confirmed anti-inflammatory properties, and its rapid growth in fire-scarred terrain meant it was often the first available green plant in landscapes that mining operations had stripped bare. A burn treatment that only grew where fire had already been seemed almost too fitting to be coincidence, though the chemistry behind it had nothing to do with poetry. By the third winter in camp, the men who had survived this long were not the lucky ones. They were the ones who had learned, fast, which plants meant survival and which ones meant nothing at all. Bitterroot, the small pink-flowered plant that gave an entire state its nickname, was harvested and dried by indigenous communities long before any miner arrived. And the dried root provided dense, storable nutrition during the lean months when supply trains failed. Miners who learned to recognize and prepare it correctly, because the bitter outer layer had to be removed before the starchy core beneath could be eaten, gained access to a food source that required no trade goods and no waiting on a delayed shipment. The knowledge of how to process it safely, passed from indigenous communities to desperate newcomers, was the difference between a meal and a stomach that could not tolerate what it had just eaten. 25 remedies, pulled from 4 cultures that never would have collided anywhere except a mountain full of gold. The miners who survived did not survive because they found fortune. Most of them never did. They survived because somebody, somewhere in that chaos, knew which plants stopped the bleeding and which ones settled the fever. That knowledge moved faster than any newspaper, camp to camp, language to language, because everyone understood what was at stake. Subscribe to Forgotten American Ways. The next story is still buried out there, waiting.